Are you ready to learn the truth about how a modern garage would seem like a luxurious palace to a medieval peasant? Winter in the Middle Ages was not just a season, but a silent killer that tested the strength of house walls every night. In those days, there was no such thing as personal space, and loneliness was a sure sign of imminent death.
The giant.
People locked themselves within four walls, cutting off the cold, but also fresh air. It was a constant struggle, where the main weapons were not swords, but the warmth of another person's body and the hot stones of the hearth. Life was reduced to the size of a single room, where people's breath, animal fumes, and acrid smoke mingled.
Watch the video to the end and you will learn why sleeping in cramped quarters was the only way to survive until dawn.
And how exactly the stench saved entire families from certain death. What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval houses was a romantic lie? The walls of a peasant's dwelling were not a reliable protection at all, but rather resembled a sieve through which the icy wind whistled. A commoner's house was often a frame of poles covered with a mixture of clay and straw, which cracked in severe frosts. The cold penetrated these cracks, turning the water in buckets into solid ice by morning. The floor was made of compacted earth, which drew heat from the feet faster than a person could warm up.
The earthen floor never dried out completely, remaining a source of dampness and grave cold throughout the winter.
To insulate themselves from the frozen ground, people covered the floor with a thick layer of straw or reeds. This flooring served as the only carpet, mattress, and insulation, separating the living from the icy ground. The straw was rarely changed, and by the middle of winter, it had turned into a matted, rotting mass. But even such bedding was worth its weight in gold, as it created an air gap. The roof over their heads was also far from perfect, and often caused additional problems. Although the thatched roof retained heat, it constantly needed repair and leaked meltwater during thaws. The snow that accumulated on the roof served as additional insulation, but its weight threatened to collapse the dilapidated buildings. Inside the house, it was always dim, as windows were a luxury that most people could not afford. Instead of glass, oiled paper, ox bladders, or simply wooden shutters were used, which were tightly closed for the winter. This preserved what little heat there was, but plunged the dwelling into eternal darkness, diluted only by the glimmers of fire. The air tightness of such a house was relative, and drafts roamed the room like rightful owners. Doors were made low and narrow to minimize heat loss when entering and exiting. The threshold was raised high, creating a barrier to the cold air creeping along the ground. The whole family's life was spent fighting to keep every degree of temperature inside this fragile shelter. People learned to feel the slightest movements of air to find the most windless place in the house. The corners of the room froze first, and frost often formed there, sparkling in the light of the hearth. The middle of the room became the most desirable place for which there was an unspoken struggle.
It was the architecture of the house that dictated the harsh rules of survival, forcing people to huddle together.
A lone person in such a house was doomed to freeze, as they could not warm the space with their body heat. The house was not a fortress, it was only a shell inside which life glowed. And this life depended on how tightly the inhabitants could close ranks. I wonder how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world, where winters are still harsh today. Where are you from? Write in the comments if you have ever had to spend the night in extreme cold. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about survival. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the comfort of a medieval hearth? In the center of the only room was an open hearth, which was both a god and a demon for the inhabitants of the house. Most houses did not have chimneys in the modern sense, and smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or simply seeped through the straw. This meant that the upper part of the room was always filled with acrid, thick smog. People were forced to stay closer to the floor, where the air was relatively clean and breathable. The hearth gave life, provided a meager meal, and was the only source of light during long evenings. The stones around the fire pit heated up during the day and gave off heat at night, functioning as a primitive battery. The place by the fire was considered the most honorable and was given to the head of the family or the weakest members of the clan. Keeping the fire going was a sacred duty because if it went out, the house would instantly cool down.
Firewood was a valuable resource that was harvested in the spring and used with fanatical thrift.
Often brushwood, peat, or dried manure, which had a distinctive smell, was used for fuel. This smell permeated people's clothes, hair, and skin, becoming an integral part of their being. The smoke irritated the eyes and caused a constant cough that accompanied a person from birth to death. The walls and ceiling of the house were covered with a thick layer of soot, which, however, served as an additional antiseptic. In wet weather, the smoke did not escape through the opening, but spread throughout the room, forcing people to open the doors and let in the frost. It was an endless choice between suffocating warmth and fresh air with the risk of freezing. Sparks from open fires constantly threatened to set fire to the dry straw on the floor or roof. Fires were common, and people feared burning alive no less than freezing to death. Wet clothes and shoes were dried around the hearth, filling the air with heavy steam. Water was also heated here so that people could at least occasionally wash their faces and hands without taking off the rest of their clothes. The fire brought the family together, gathering everyone in a tight circle of light and warmth in the midst of the all-consuming darkness. At night, the coals were carefully covered with ash so that they would smolder until morning, preserving the heat of the hearth. In the morning, the first thing they did was to fan these coals, praying that the spark would not go out during the night. The hearth dictated the rhythm of life. As long as the fire burned, life went on. When it went out, a time of torpor set in.
It was primitive, dirty, but effective heating that allowed humanity to survive the Little Ice Age.
The smoke preserved not only the meat hanging from the ceiling, but also the people themselves. Life in smoke was the price to pay for not turning into an ice statue. Have you ever thought that the hearth could be not only a source of heat, but also the cause of chronic diseases? Are you ready to find out who else shared this cramped space with people? The answer awaits you in the next chapter. What I'm about to show you is prohibited by sanitary standards in any modern country in the world. All valuable livestock was herded into the same single room where people live for the winter. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens became full-fledged neighbors, separated from people only by a symbolic partition or pole. This was done not only to protect the animals from wolves and the cold, but also for a purely pragmatic purpose. A large animal, such as a cow, gives off a huge amount of heat, acting as a powerful living radiator. A cow's body temperature is higher than that of a human, and its breath filled the room with warm, moist air. The family literally warmed themselves side by side with their livestock, using its biological heat to heat their home. The presence of animals raised the temperature in the house by a few precious degrees, which was enough for survival.
Of course, this proximity brought with it unimaginable filth and the heavy smells of manure and wet wool.
People lived with the constant aroma of the barn, but this smell was perceived as a smell of prosperity and security. The animals breathed, chewed, and moved, creating a background noise that reassured people in the darkness. The heat from the rotting manure, which was not removed every day, also helped to heat the room. Chickens usually slept on perches directly above the heads of people or animals, adding their gifts to the general chaos. Pigs could sleep in a corner, burrowing into the straw, and often served as heaters for dogs or cats. Such close cohabitation blurred the line between humans and nature, returning people to a state of the herd. Caring for animals was simplified, as there was no need to go out into the cold to feed or milk them. Morning milking took place a stone's throw from where the family slept. The animals also felt calmer around people, getting their share of warmth from the hearth.
It was a symbiosis developed over centuries of necessity, where disgust gave way to the instinct of self-preservation.
The loss of a cow in winter was a tragedy comparable to the death of a relative, as it meant the loss of a breadwinner and a source of warmth. The space in the house was divided into clean and dirty areas in a very arbitrary way, and straw was scattered all over the floor. In particularly severe frosts, small animals such as lambs or piglets could be taken directly into the human bed. Heat exchange between species was maximized, creating a single ecosystem in a closed space. It was often the animals that saved the family from freezing when the firewood ran out or the hearth went out. Their hot breath and massive bodies created a microclimate that fire alone could not create. To modern man, this seems barbaric, but for a medieval peasant, the sound of a cow chewing in the dark was the sound of hope. It was a unique survival strategy where man sacrificed comfort for the sake of life. If you think this is the limit of cramped conditions, you are mistaken. Like this post if you want to know exactly how people slept in such conditions. Are you ready for the shocking truth that the concept of intimate life did not exist as a fact? In medieval homes, there was usually only one sleeping area for the entire family. This could be a wide platform bed covered with hay and animal skins, or simply a fenced-off section of the floor near the hearth. Everyone slept in this communal bed: parents, elderly people, teenagers, and even the youngest members of the family. Sleeping together was not a whim, but a critically important technique for conserving heat on cold nights. People lay down tightly, pressing their backs and stomachs against each other, creating a single cocoon. The most vulnerable, babies and the elderly, were placed in the center so that they could be warmed by the bodies of their stronger relatives. The outer places were occupied by adult men, ready to jump up in case of danger or to check the hearth. This way of sleeping allowed them to survive nights when the temperature in the house dropped to around 0. Blankets were in short supply, so they often used one large skin or woven cloth for everyone. The heat of a dozen bodies accumulated under one cover, creating a temperature compatible with life. Clothes were practically never taken off at night, except for loosening belts and removing heavy footwear. People slept in their undergarments and often in their woolen outer clothing if it was particularly cold. Headgear, such as nightcaps, was mandatory, as precious heat escaped through the head. There was no personal space while sleeping. Every movement of a neighbor was felt throughout the entire living chain: snoring, coughing, tossing and turning. All of this was shared, something they had grown accustomed to since childhood. In such cramped conditions, conflicts over blankets or warmer places were inevitable, but the cold quickly reconciled everyone. Marital duties were performed right there, quietly and unobtrusively, under the cover of shared darkness and snoring. Children grew up perceiving the physical closeness of relatives as a natural norm of security. In the morning, this living tangle would break up so that everyone could go about their duties, but at night it would gather again. This collective warmth was the only guarantee that everyone would wake up in the morning. Even guests, if there were any, would lie down in the same pile or next to it, close to the host. It was impossible to isolate a sick family member, so infections spread instantly to everyone sleeping. But to send the sick person out into the cold meant killing them, so the risk was accepted as inevitable. Sleep was not just rest, but collective work to generate heat. This tradition of sleeping together persisted in villages for centuries, disappearing only with the advent of affordable fuel. But what did they eat to keep their internal fire burning? You'll find out in the next chapter. The winter diet of a medieval family was extremely meager, monotonous, and entirely subordinated to one main goal: conserving energy at any cost. In the bitter cold, the human body required many more calories just to maintain a normal body temperature. Food became fuel, and its taste took a back seat to its nutritional value. Hot food was not just a way to satisfy hunger, but the only available method of warming up from the inside. The basis of survival was thick, rich soups that bubbled in a cauldron over the hearth from morning till night. Soups made from coarse grains, beans, turnips, and cabbage were cooked for hours, turning into a homogeneous, hot mass. This eternal soup never ran out. Water was simply added to the cauldron, and new ingredients were thrown in to replace those that had been eaten. Liquid hot food was absorbed more quickly and instantly warmed the blood. Real meat was extremely rare on the peasant's table and appeared only on major holidays. More often, heavily salted lard or dried fish, hard as wood, was used. These products were added to the common stew in small pieces solely for fat and flavor. Fat was the most valuable nutrient of that era, providing long-lasting energy and a welcome feeling of fullness. Without fat, people quickly became weak and began to feel cold even by the fire. Bread baked in the fall or on rare days when the stove was heated became stale and rock hard by midwinter. It was impossible to bite into it without risking breaking your teeth, so the crust had to be soaked in hot broth for a long time. Bread served not so much as a delicacy as a thickener for soup. All edible supplies were stored here, right in the living quarters, so they would be close at hand and under supervision. Sacks of grain stood in the corners, bundles of onions and dried herbs hung from the ceiling, and barrels of pickles piled up against the walls. This created additional cramped conditions and a specific smell, but it ensured that the food would not freeze through. In addition, it was safer this way. No one could steal the precious supplies under the cover of night. Rodents were a constant and terrible problem that threatened the well-being of the entire family. Rats and mice could destroy a winter's supply of grain in a couple of weeks, condemning people to starvation. Therefore, good cats were valued on the farm no less than milking cows. Cats were cherished, allowed to warm themselves by the hearth, and never mistreated. People tried to drink only hot water, as ice-cold water took away precious heat from the body. They often brewed cheap local herbs or added a little honey to boiling water if they had any left over from the summer. This helped not only to warm up, but also to get at least some vitamins. Drinking was part of the warming ritual, just as important as wearing woolen clothes. Alcohol in the form of weak homemade ale or thick beer was consumed by absolutely everyone, including children and teenagers. This drink was considered liquid bread because it was very caloric and gave a deceptive feeling of warmth. However, drunkenness in winter was a deadly dangerous pastime. A person who fell asleep drunk in a cold corner away from the hearth might never wake up again. The diet strictly depended on the short daylight hours and the need to conserve firewood. People usually ate twice a day, late in the morning, when dawn broke, and early in the evening, before it got completely dark. The hot black cauldron was the center of attraction for the whole family, the main sacred object in the house. They gathered around it with wooden spoons in their hands, eagerly awaiting their portion of the stew. They ate very quickly, intently and silently, trying to swallow their food before it cooled down. Talking at the table was considered a luxury because an open mouth let the heat escape. Wooden bowls were scraped clean with a piece of bread until there was not a crumb left and they were shiny. Throwing food away was considered a terrible sin and madness. Periodically, there were strict days of church fasting when any animal food was completely excluded from the diet. This made survival in the cold even more difficult for weakened people. But even during fasting, housewives tried to cook hot meals, generously using vegetable oils, hemp, and nuts. Vegetable fat helped to compensate for the lack of lard. Hunger was a constant backdrop to winter, a familiar feeling that never completely disappeared. Every bite of food was perceived as a great gift from God and the result of hard work. From an early age, children knew the value of bread and never played with food. The sight of a full pot was more soothing than any prayer. The ability to wisely distribute scarce supplies so that they would last until the first spring grass was the main talent of the housewife. Every day she solved a difficult problem: how much grain to take today so as not to die tomorrow. If the food ran out ahead of time, the family faced a painful death from starvation. The only alternative was to go begging on the roads, where it was even easier to freeze to death. The human metabolism was forced to switch to a slower winter mode. People instinctively moved less, did everything smoothly, saving their energy. Extra movements meant extra calories, which there was nowhere to get. Laziness became a virtue and a way to prolong life. Hibernation, in a figurative sense, was characteristic of humans as well as bears. Long hours without movement under a pile of skins helped conserve energy to fight the cold. Food was the only fuel for the human internal furnace, and the quality of this fuel directly affected the body's ability to resist freezing to death. Guess how much time medieval people spent in absolute impenetrable darkness. In winter, daylight hours were negligible, and most of the day the house was plunged into thick darkness. The sun rose late and set early, leaving people with only a few hours of gray twilight. Candles made from pure beeswax were an incredibly expensive luxury. They were only available to the wealthy church and the nobility living in stone castles. Ordinary people used cheap tallow candles or primitive grease lamps. These were simple clay bowls with melted animal fat and a rag wick floating in it. These light sources smoked mercilessly, covering the ceiling with soot and emitting a heavy smell of burnt lard. They gave off a dim, uncertain, and flickering light that quickly tired the eyes. Most often, the only source of light was the open flame of the central hearth. It cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, which frightened children and stirred their imaginations. The darkness severely limited any useful activity inside the house. It was impossible to sew, spin fine thread, repair small tools, or engage in crafts. People were forced to learn to navigate their cramped rooms literally by touch. They knew every protrusion on the wall, every notch on the bench, and every crack in the floor. Life slowed down, shifting into a passive mode of quiet conversation, fairy tales, and oral traditions. Darkness became a time for the transfer of wisdom from the old to the young. It was during these long, dark hours by the hearth that knowledge, family history, and ancient legends were passed on. Culture was oral, and memory replaced books for people. Darkness erased the visual boundaries of the world, making hearing and smell the main senses. Sight took a back seat, giving way to instincts. People could unerringly recognize each other in the dark by the rhythm of their breathing, their gait, and their smell. The rustle of straw could say more than a glance. The fear of darkness was not an irrational childhood fear, but a well-founded sense of self-preservation. In pitch darkness, it was easy to stumble upon hot coals, spill boiling water, or step on a sleeping animal. Light was conserved totally and ruthlessly in every poor household. A precious torch was lit only in cases of extreme necessity, such as when someone fell ill. People went to bed immediately after sunset so as not to waste fat and firewood unnecessarily. Life came to a standstill with the departure of the last ray of sunlight. The long winter nights seemed endless, stretching on forever. Waiting for dawn turned into daily torture with insomnia and cold. People lay in the dark, listening to the howling wind, waiting for a sign that the world still existed. Time lost its usual count. Psychologically, the eternal darkness weighed heavily on the mind, causing deep despondency. This gave rise to a feeling of hopelessness, which we would now call severe seasonal depression. The lack of bright sunlight had a devastating effect on physical health. The skin became pale and transparent, and the bones became brittle due to a lack of vitamins. But the darkness also provided a kind of shelter, hiding the squalor of everyday life. In the darkness, you couldn't see the dirty walls, the sooty ceiling, or the incredible crampedness of the dwelling. It hid poverty and ruin, making the world a little gentler. It was the only mercy that the long night offered. In the darkness, all members of the household became equal, and the rigid social roles within the family were somewhat smoothed out. It was impossible to see who was wearing what or whose face was dirtier. It was a time of mysticism and superstition. Every creak of a beam seemed like the cautious steps of an evil force sneaking up on people. The fire in the hearth was the only protector and friend in the midst of this all-consuming darkness. People prayed to it, fed it, and feared losing it.
Bless this.
When morning finally came and gray light seeped through the cracks in the shutters, it was perceived as a miracle. Each dawn was a small victory of life over death. But what if I told you that poor hygiene was another way to stay warm? That dirt on the body was valued as much as warm clothing? The answer to this question may seem disgusting to you, but it was perfectly logical at the time. Wait for the shocking details in the next chapter. Modern standards of cleanliness would have caused a medieval peasant deep confusion and possibly serious illness. Washing in winter was not just a rare event, but a truly extraordinary and dangerous one for one's health. Doctors of the time seriously believed that hot water opened the pores of the skin, allowing disease and deadly cold to enter. Undressing in an icy house and pouring water over oneself meant voluntarily exposing oneself to a huge risk of pneumonia. Therefore, people deliberately did not wash for months on end, limiting themselves to quickly wiping their faces and hands with ice-cold water. The layer of centuries-old dirt and skin oil that thickly covered the body served as a kind of additional protective barrier from the external environment. Natural skin oil reliably protected the skin from painful drying out and frostbite in the wind. It worked like an ointment, retaining precious heat inside the body. Washing off this layer meant depriving oneself of natural protection against the cold. Hair that had not seen a comb or water since autumn fell into thick tangles. They created a kind of felt cap that also warmed the head and protected the neck from drafts. It was impossible to comb such hair, but no one tried to do so until the warm weather arrived. A person's appearance took a back seat to physical survival. Clothes were never washed during the winter, as it was practically impossible to dry them properly in a damp, cold house. Wet fabric could become moldy or freeze solid, making it unsuitable for wear. The fabric gradually became saturated with acrid sweat, thick smoke from the hearth, and grease from the table. Over time, it became stiff and dense, resembling a kind of armor or shell. This dense cultural layer on clothing made it much less permeable to the icy winter wind. Dirt clogged the weave of the threads, creating an airtight crust. The dirtier the shirt, the warmer it was to work outside or sleep in. Aesthetics and neatness were considered signs of stupidity or effeminacy. Body odors were so strong, pungent, and familiar that they were simply no longer noticed in everyday life. People's sense of smell adapted to the constant stench, and it became simply the background of existence. The heavy stench of unwashed human bodies mixed with the pungent smells of domestic animals, which often spent the winter indoors. Added to this was the smell of smoke, rotten straw, and cooking food, creating an indescribably thick atmosphere in the dwelling. The fight against the ubiquitous parasites was sluggish and passive, as it was impossible to defeat them. Lice and fleas were simply shaken out of clothing over a fire or crushed with fingernails when the opportunity arose. Getting rid of them completely in conditions of overcrowding and filth was absolutely unrealistic. Itching became a familiar companion in life, which people tried not to pay attention to. The straw on the floor was only changed in the spring, and during the long winter, it accumulated all kinds of waste products. Layer upon layer, it was pressed under the feet of people and the hooves of animals. This inevitably created appalling unsanitary conditions in the house. However, the rotting organic matter at the bottom gave off a little heat, which rose and warmed the room. The concept of sterility was completely absent from the minds of people of that era, and their immune systems were constantly under extreme stress. Only those whose bodies could cope with such a bacterial load survived. Any scratch could become inflamed, but dirt was perceived as a given, not as an enemy. Toilet needs were taken care of either in a bucket standing in a dark corner or by running outside. Going to the wooden toilet was always a real test of the bitter cold and wind. People held on until the last minute so they wouldn't have to leave the warm room. The contents of the chamber pots were often poured out near the doorstep, which obviously didn't improve the atmosphere in the yard. True cleansing came only with the long-awaited spring, when the sun warmed the air. Then it was possible to bathe in the river or finally heat up a lot of water outside for a big wash. In winter, however, dirt was a faithful ally, preserving precious body heat at all costs. It was a necessary and unpleasant measure, dictated by the harsh logic of survival. No one judged each other for being unkempt or smelly, as everyone was in exactly the same situation. The king and the beggar smelled about the same after 3 months of winter. Cleanliness was an incredible luxury, available only in the warm season. The winter clothing of a medieval peasant was a complex, multi-layered construction that was rarely taken off completely. It was not just a costume, but a life support system that was worn around the clock. The basis of the wardrobe was a long linen or hemp shirt that reached to the knees. It absorbed sweat and was the only layer that was sometimes washed or aired out. Woolen coats, thick tunics, and pants were worn over the shirt. The number of layers depended on the person's wealth and the severity of the weather outside. People resembled cabbages wearing everything they had in the house. It was not customary to take off the outer layers indoors, as it was also cold inside. Wool was the main material for survival and was valued as much as gold. It had the amazing property of warming the body even when wet from snow or sweat. The fabric was coarse, prickly, homespun, and often unpleasant to the touch. but it did an excellent job of trapping warm air in its fibers, creating a microclimate around the body. The more layers were worn, the more air pockets were created between them. It was this still air that was the best insulator against the piercing cold. Poor people wore rags on top of rags, creating a voluminous and warm structure. No one cared about appearance. The main criterion was the ability to retain heat. Heavy cloaks made of thick felted cloth or sheepskin coats served as outerwear. Sheepskin was a sign of a wealthy family and an object of envy among neighbors. Fur was always worn with the skin side in, against the body, so that it would warm the person, not just decorate them on the outside. This way of wearing fur was much more effective for retaining heat. Footwear was the weakest point in the winter equipment of medieval people. Simple leather boots quickly got wet in the snow and mud, threatening frostbite of the toes. Therefore, they were generously stuffed with dry straw or hay for insulation. The grass absorbed moisture and created an air cushion around the foot. Sometimes the feet were wrapped in pieces of coarse fabric or old skins directly over the shoes. This additional insulation helped prevent frostbite when working in deep snow. Such improvised boots looked clumsy, but they saved lives. Thick woolen or leather mittens were always worn on the hands. Mittens were often made with 3 fingers, so that it was easier to do rough work with an axe or pitchfork. Fingers gathered together kept each other warmer than in gloves. Losing a mitten in the forest was a real tragedy, threatening the loss of hands. The head had to be covered at all times, day and night. Hoods and thick felt or fur hats were not taken off even indoors or at the table. A tremendous amount of heat was lost through an uncovered head, and people felt it. They also slept in nightcaps or scarves. A wide belt played an important role, pressing all layers of clothing tightly against the body. It prevented icy drafts from getting under the shirt and kept the lower back warm. Necessary tools, knives, and purses were also carried on the belt. Tightening the belt meant to gather oneself and stay warm. Winter clothing was very heavy and severely restricted movement. Walking in such attire was not easy. Every step required effort, but taking it off was tantamount to complete disarmament in front of a deadly enemy. Often, people wore literally everything they had. By the end of winter, peasants turned into shapeless, dirty lumps of woolen skins. It was impossible to distinguish a figure under these layers. Holes and tears in clothing were mended immediately and very carefully. After all, any hole, even the smallest one, meant a loss of precious warmth. Clothes were passed down from father to son and worn until they were completely worn out. The value of a good warm item was much higher than that of jewelry or money. A warm cloak could be worth killing for on the highway. The loss of clothing in a fire was a disaster for the whole family. Sleeping in outer clothing was the norm for most of the population. This allowed them to save on expensive blankets and keep each other warm with their collective body heat. In addition, it allowed them to be prepared for any unexpected event, from fire to attack. Getting up at night and getting dressed in a freezing house would have been torture. Undressing at night would be perceived by others as madness or extreme carelessness. People lived in their cocoons for months without seeing their own bodies. Clothing became an integral part of the body, a second skin that protected fragile human flesh from the icy world. People literally lived inside their suits until the sun allowed them to free themselves. Ventilation in a winter house was a concept that was practically incompatible with the main task, preserving heat at any cost. To save precious degrees, people carefully caulked the walls, checking every inch of their homes. They plugged every tiny crack with dry moss, old rags, or thick clay. Windows, if there were any, were closed with shutters and often covered with skins or thick fabric. This inevitably led to the flow of fresh air from the street being almost completely cut off. The house turned into an airtight capsule, cut off from the outside world by an icy crust. Inside, carbon dioxide from the breath of many people and animals quickly accumulated. This was mixed with carbon monoxide from the hearth, which often smoked into the room due to poor draft or wind. Add to this the vapors from unwashed bodies and waste products, and the picture becomes complete. The air became thick, heavy, and palpable. The oxygen concentration dropped rapidly, causing the inhabitants of the house to feel constantly sleepy and lethargic. People felt exhausted even after a long sleep, and their movements became sluggish. Severe headaches were a common and inevitable companion of long winter evenings. However, they were rarely associated with air quality, being attributed to fatigue, the evil eye, or the machinations of evil spirits. No one knew anything about chemistry, but everyone felt heaviness in their temples. High humidity from breathing and constantly drying wet clothes contributed to the rapid growth of black mold in the corners. The walls often wept with condensation, creating an ideal environment for fungi and bacteria. The stale, heavy air was so dense and saturated that it seemed you could cut it with a knife. Eyes watered from the acrid smoke, and there was a constant tickle in the throat. When the door was opened on rare occasions, thick clouds of frosty steam rushed in with a noise. They instantly cooled the room, chilling the heat that had accumulated over hours. It looked like an invasion of a hostile element into the cozy world of people. The floor immediately became icy, and the cold crept up the legs, penetrating to the bones. Therefore, doors were opened very quickly, and only when absolutely necessary, immediately slamming them shut again with a bang. Anyone who lingered on the threshold received a dose of abuse from the household. The lack of oxygen slowed down the body's metabolism, which paradoxically helped to save energy and food. People wanted to eat less when they were in a state of semi-sleep. The inhabitants of winter houses moved more slowly, thought more slowly, falling into a kind of human suspended animation. This state resembled the winter hibernation of bears, only with their eyes open. Life processes slowed down, waiting for better times and a fresh breeze. The brain went into energy-saving mode, shutting down unnecessary emotions and thoughts. The risk of dying from carbon monoxide poisoning was very high and frightened people more than hunger. This often happened if the housewife closed the stove damper too early to save the heat of the coals. Death from carbon monoxide poisoning was quiet, insidious, and completely invisible. It often took entire families in one night, leaving them sleeping forever in their beds. But people feared drafts even more than suffocating stuffiness and stench. After all, a draft inevitably brought a cold, which in those days quickly developed into pneumonia. And pneumonia without antibiotics was practically a death sentence for children and the elderly. It was easier to endure the stench than to let disease into the house. Therefore, the choice was always made in favor of stale, stuffy, but life-saving warm air. Adaptation to constant hypoxia was an integral part of winter survival for generations. People's lungs got used to breathing this toxic mixture of smoke, fumes, and dust. The body learned to extract oxygen from the minimum that was available. Only the first spring wind and the wide-open windows and doors brought long-awaited relief. Fresh air rushed into the house, making your head spin and causing real euphoria. It was like being intoxicated with oxygen after a long period of suffocation. In winter, however, air was a shared, limited resource that was divided among everyone. People inhaled and exhaled it in a circle, becoming a single organism. Living in a confined space, shoulder to shoulder, was a serious test for the human psyche. Imagine a large family locked in one room for several months in a row. The lack of any opportunity for privacy created a high level of emotional tension that hung in the air. Any little thing could spark a serious conflict. People learned to strictly suppress irritation and aggression for the common good. An open quarrel in a confined space was dangerous and could destroy the fragile peace in the house. There was nowhere to go to cool off except into the cold, which was tantamount to death. They had to endure each other's habits, sounds, and smells around the clock. Over the centuries, unspoken but strict rules of winter cohabitation were developed. It was necessary to speak quietly, not make sudden movements so as not to disturb one's neighbor, and respect others' sleep. Excessive noise could wake a baby or anger a tired father, which could have dire consequences. Patience became the main virtue necessary to preserve one's sanity. Everyone knew each other's habits down to the smallest and sometimes annoying details. How someone chewed, how they snored, how they coughed. All this was known and sometimes became unbearable. But people learned to ignore it, creating internal barriers. The ability to switch off from reality was an important skill. Children learned to be invisible shadows so as not to fall victim to the hot hands of tired and nervous adults. Games were quiet, often confined to a corner by the stove or under the table. The elderly tried their best to be useful so as not to feel like a burden or extra mouths to feed. They mended clothes, told endless stories, or watched over the fire. The hierarchy in such cramped quarters was extremely rigid and vertical. The word of the head of the family was law, not subject to any discussion or doubt. Democracy in a winter hut was impossible. One captain was needed to keep the ship from sinking. Only unquestioning obedience ensured order in the chaos of cramped quarters. Hard work, communal prayer, and shared meals were daily rituals that held this microcosm together. People sat at the same table, ate from the same dishes, and prayed to the same gods. The outside world beyond the walls seemed hostile, icy, and infinitely distant. Home remained the only tiny island of safety in an ocean of cold. The feeling of an elbow was not a metaphor, but a literal physical sensation every day. You always felt the warmth, breath, or movement of another person next to you. Loneliness was an unattainable luxury that perhaps someone secretly dreamed of. But it was this closeness that gave them a chance to survive. This formed a special collective consciousness, where the personal I dissolved into the common we. People did not think of themselves outside of their family or community, as it was physically impossible to survive alone.
Right enough.
A person without a family was doomed to die of cold or hunger. Winter confinement brought people together, creating bonds stronger than any blood oath. But it also crippled the psyche, depriving people of their will and personal space for thought. Months within four walls weighed on the mind, causing melancholy and apathy. Spring was perceived by everyone not only as physical liberation, but also as a huge psychological liberation. It was the moment when the prison doors finally swung open. The first time out on the street without warm clothes in the open green fields was a breath of intoxicating freedom. After months of voluntary imprisonment, the world seemed huge and bright. The eyes were unaccustomed to the horizon, and the legs to walking fast. The joy of simple movement was boundless. This harsh winter school of humility and endless patience shaped the character of medieval man. He knew how to wait for the best, how to endure hardship, and how to truly appreciate the warmth of his neighbor. Selfishness froze along with those who did not want to share their warmth. Survival was a collective project where success depended on everyone's contribution. We have seen that medieval winter was not a beautiful fairy tale, but a harsh battle for warmth and life. One room, one hearth, and the close embrace of family. This was the arsenal that allowed people to withstand the deadly cold. They sacrificed comfort, cleanliness, and personal space for the sake of simply seeing the next spring. Their survival was a miracle of adaptation and fortitude. What did you find most unbearable in this story? Could you live like this for even a week? Suggest topics for future videos about life in the past that you would like to see in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because history still holds many shocking secrets.